Welcome to the InnerVerse. It's an illusion.
Welcome to the One Within All to another episode of InnerVerse podcast. I'm your host, Chance, and I hope this glorious day or evening finds you in perfect harmony with the way and with all that is. We are joined in this episode by Gregory Ripley, who is an author and a Taoist priest who has recently completed another book called The 100 Remedies of the Tao. So in this conversation, we'll pick Greg's brain about the life-affirming philosophies that he's been sharing in his work throughout the last many years and see what other interesting avenues the esoteric threads might take us down. And thanks for being here, Gregory. Welcome to InnerVerse.
Hey, my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Chance.
So I basically just saw your book in the publisher catalog. It jumped out at me as somebody who's had a very long time interest in at least some parts of Taoism, the I Ching being a particular favorite of mine. Really like that as a tool. And so it just seemed like a theme this month for me to be just digging into the ways that we can heal ourselves within and without, including our world, by more harmonious ways of thinking and being in the world. So 100 Remedies of the Tao was right up my alley. I enjoyed perusing that book, and I'd love for you to introduce yourself and your work for us today.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So Gregory Ripley, of course, and let's see. I've written a couple books on Taoism now, and kind of have a background in Asian studies. I did Asian studies in college, kind of focused on China as a concentration of interest. And later on went on to acupuncture school and did that for a while. And just been involved in this kind of stuff for a lot of years, whether it's Taoism specifically or, Chinese medicine or related things, Tai Chi and Qigong and all that. So anything else in particular you want to know, I'm happy to chat about. So.
Well, there's just a lot of things right in there that are interesting and fun to talk about. I myself enjoy a decent Qigong practice. I'm sure everyone's could always be better, but maybe we'll just start with that. How has pursuing these avenues academically led to transformative benefits in your life in terms of behaviors and actions?
Yeah, a lot of ways, I suppose. I think my original interest in those things, part of it was, health related always, as it is with a lot of people. Part of it was just an enjoyment of doing the practices, especially with Tai Chi. I started while I was in college, and just, really enjoyed how it felt to do it, just sort of embodying some of that sense of flow and relaxation. Learning how to work with other people in a kind of less confrontational manner, with push hands practice and things like that. And then, for me, it flowed into the rest of my life too. Like when I was in college, I worked in coffee shops for years, and sometimes I'd find myself, well, often in one shop in particular, we often worked by ourselves. And so every once in a while you'd get slammed, have a line out the door, and it was just you know, having to deal with it. So you just had to kind of put your head down, take one order at a time. And, you know, I'd find myself moving in ways that were familiar from Tai Chi forms and stuff like that, right? Efficiency of movement and smoothness, not trying to rush, but trying to smoothly do things quickly, right? And in a mindful, controlled sort of way. And then you could get through your rush, and it was almost like it never even happened. You'd be like, oh, okay, there's the end of the line. Versus when you get in the weeds and you feel that sense of urgency and stress, and you're like starting to freak out, you know. But if you can just take it moment by moment, that's before you know it, it's over. So
Yeah, that's something worth keeping in mind, especially people like me. I'm born under the sign of Aries, so impatience is kind of the default for me. And I think a lot of us have noticed that the less patient we are, the more to hurry we are, the more things we do that sabotage us and actually make things take longer. So the smooth, you know, emphasis on smooth, I think that's a very Tao type of thing. I'm wondering though, in your experience with Tai Chi or Qigong, have you ever had any experiences that kind of bent your notions of the solidity of material reality? Anything, you know, out there happen?
You know, nothing, nothing too surreal or mind blowing, other than, you know, a common experience. Sometimes people will even talk about Qigong consciousness or something like that, right? Or like the state of Qigong that they're kind of aiming for when they're practicing. And to me, it often, that kind of feeling, it's often like a feeling of, you know, first a sense of like unified sense of embodiment, kind of, you know, like you can have your awareness be in particular places within your body, but then you can have a sense when you sort of feel like your awareness has filled your entire body and you can't really differentiate one place from another. And then you get a sense where you kind of start to lose a sense of where your skin ends and the rest of the world begins, you know? And I suppose it's, in Western terms, it's probably something akin to a unity consciousness or something like that. Those kinds of things, you know, often when I'm in nature, especially, that kind of a reaction is much easier to come by. But nothing like, you know, I'm not sticking my hand through walls or anything like that. But
Not setting newspapers on fire yet with just
no,
your chi.
haven't quite built up that friction yet, or learned those tricks. Either way.
No, you wouldn't be allowed to tell us if you did.
That's right. That's right. It's a highly guarded secret. You know, you have to come sit on the mountain for 5 years, and then maybe no.
When I first started practicing Qigong, I did a particular movement and I noticed that as I whooshed in one direction, a poster just all of a sudden blew off the wall as if it had been hit by a gust of wind. And I was like, did I do that? It was very strange. And another time I was practicing with a friend who also had a pretty long-term experience with it. And he showed me this thing where, you know, the basic thing of having an energy ball between your hands and then breathing in and feeling it expand and then retracting it and becoming aware of the borders and edges of that energy. So he put my hands between his, so his were outside of mine and mine were together. And he did the energy ball expansion thing. And my hands on their own moved and expanded outward as if they were on a string that someone else was pulling. And that was pretty trippy. And to me, that was like the first touch of the Qigong state that you're talking about. And then since then, it's sort of become the goal when practicing to not really control the movement of my body, but just intend to follow the form and then let the breath and the expansiveness of and contracting of the breath actually be what pushes the body along the meridian lines to do the motion? Does that all kind of click?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. It's almost like you get this feeling of like that you're just watching yourself move or something, almost like it's just happening all by itself, and you're just going, "Oh wow, look, this is going so smoothly! Like, what's happening here?" And yeah, I've had times like that too with with partner practices, right? Like push hands and stuff, where if you do the if you do it correctly, you feel like you didn't do anything. You're like, how did that happen? Like, I was trying so hard before, or I was, fine tuning and trying to adjust my movements and stuff. And then when you just sort of let go and follow the pattern, then it's like magic happens or something, right? It's like, you don't even feel like you're touching the person. Unlike, I'm not knocking people down from across the room, that kind of stuff. I think there's a little hypnotic suggestion going on there with those people, but yeah, that sense of there's no longer any sort of volition to it or something. It's like it's spontaneously happening or something. It's like you've just maybe there's a little bit of a spark of a catalyst of intention, and that's about it. And after that, it's like it just happens on its own.
So do you think that's in our practices, in our individual moments of the repetitious motions, is that like a microcosm of the idea of Wu Wei? Can we get into Wu Wei as a concept in the macro and micro?
Yeah, definitely. I think so. It's like, a lot of times people just want to translate it very straightforwardly as non-action. And of course, it's not that you're just sitting there doing nothing, literally. I mean, although there are times when the best or most efficient or most effective action would be to do nothing. So there is that aspect to it, but I think it's also, we can look at it in terms of, like the most efficient or effective action in a situation, and if we looked at it in the microcosm, it would be like I don't know what's the best word to use. You could say the best action or the most appropriate action maybe would be a good word, like, so that, just like all the planets are spinning in the galaxies and universes, everything's doing its thing, seemingly without any problem, any volition, any sense of self, any whatever, right? It's all just happening spontaneously or naturally or whatever. And then when we can kind of tap into that, everything goes more smoothly. Like there are less problems, there's less confrontation, or you may have problems, but they don't feel like problems. They don't seem like problems. It's like, this is just what's happening. You deal with it in the moment, you move on to the next moment and do what's most appropriate, moment to moment.
You think that's sort of the artistic or even athletic flow state as well?
Yeah, I think it's very similar. If it's not the same thing, it's really similar. So it's almost like, I almost think of it like, athletes or dancers or what have you, a really skilled craftsperson or whatever, artist, they might tap into that flow state in a particular format, right? Or with a particular set of skills that they've worked on for a lifetime. And it's almost like, someone, if we think of like a Zen master or whatever, somebody like that, it's almost like they've achieved a flow state through meditation or something. So it's not going to turn them into an NBA star or something like that, but just sitting and being, it's like they've found flow just in being or something like that. I think there's something to that.
I think so. I think it's the zone that we all want to be in. And then you make a distinction in the book I'll just save this. Let's introduce the book more properly, and then we'll get into that. So, 100 Remedies of the Tao. Why'd you write it? What do you think that people can get out of it?
Well, it's kind of interesting. The original text it came from is from 5th or 6th century, somewhere in there. And it's actually a precepts text. And normally we think of precepts as just a set of rules that you follow, right? And this one, I always thought it was kind of interesting because of the way it's framed as remedies. It's like the character for remedies, or you could say medicines, or it would be the same character you'd use for like an herbal remedy in Chinese medicine, right? So you could say medicines or something like that. But so each one is like such and such is a remedy. And I like the way it's framed because it's kind of like, we all find ourselves in situations in life where we have problems that come up, or there's a situation we don't know how to deal with, or what's the best route to go. And this is kind of saying, hey, this isn't necessarily like some hard and fast rule. It's not a thou shalt do this or not do that sort of thing. It's like doing this is a remedy for your problem or your situation. Or they also kind of frame it in the way that there's some Zen texts that do this too, where they talk about diseases of the mind in the sense that, here you have kind of like delusions about life or how things work or whatever, and that those are kind of like diseases of mind. So these are like remedies for those diseases. Similar to the idea of, like the medicine Buddha or something like that, right? The Buddha as physician or spiritual physician, something like that. So, these are remedies for situations you might find yourself in, and you may not need all of them. Hopefully you don't need all of them. But certainly, I think most of these are things that everybody can relate to, whether they're interested in Taoism specifically or just pursuing a spiritual life of any sort.
I really like the idea of medicine or remedies being basically derived from mind practices or harmony in your mind. I'm someone who does a very specific type of energy work or therapy that involves helping people see where limiting beliefs are when they came up in their life, and then reversing them, bringing free will upon stuff that they maybe thought was their personality or just how life is. So the terminology of remedies definitely fits for me, because I think that that's pretty much the origin of all disease or even disharmony in life, relationally or between yourself and the world, comes from having a preconceived notion about who you are or what the world is that is in some way limiting to the flow and expression of life force within and without you, thus eventually leading to some kind of distortion, disease, or even injury in the body.
Yeah, definitely. And it's like, whether we think of, the immune system or something like that, it's like, we know what happens when the immune system isn't functioning properly or is, hyperactive or what have you. And that, there's going to be things you have to deal with in life, whether it's physical, mental, emotional, traumas, what have you. But if you are sort of functioning, there we go, functioning optimally, you're going to be in the best position to deal with all those things, right? And so, and like you said, if you have unexplored traumas or things that you're holding on to that you aren't even aware of, if those things can be released and things can just flow in a more effortless manner, all that good stuff, how you're naturally supposed to be functioning, then
I am someone who's also really interested in language, especially from like a philological level, the type of connections you can potentially make between languages, showing some sort of affinity from one culture to another through concepts that share root phonetics. So I was wondering, when you brought up that word remedy, what was the character phonetically that you're referring to that meant remedy or medicine?
It's Yao.
Okay, that's what I thought.
Yeah.
Okay. See, that's to me really interesting because Yao is one of the names in from a more like Middle East or even Occidental perspective. Yao is an ancient name for the supreme being or the deity. It's like in Greek, it would be IAO or iota alpha omega, which is I am the alpha and omega. So when we're saying that this word in Chinese that meant remedy and medicine, but also like referred to being in harmony with the Tao, the word is Yao. That's a really cool either coincidence or interesting connection between East and West.
Yeah, for sure. And we'd have to break down the character and look at the roots of it. If there's from the visual elements of it, if there's, I don't know if that same connection would be there or as clear or perhaps clearer, right? But but from the sound, that's certainly interesting. I hadn't ever thought about that, but it makes perfect sense.
Yeah, that's something that's going to be on my mind throughout this whole conversation. Because the further I've dug into the esoteric sides of the various mythologies and religions of the world, the more it all seems to just come up as like variations of Buddhism in a sense, and maybe not variations of Buddhism as we know it today, but that some kind of precursor was making its way around the world in a type of almost near universal priest type system. And you brought up the medicine Buddha. I know there's lots of different Buddhas, but could you tell us a little bit more about this particular version of the deity?
Yeah. Let's see. Well, what is there to say? I know it best through Tibetan Buddhism. I used to study with Tibetan Buddhist teachers for many years, and so there are medicine Buddha practices. Like in Tibetan Buddhism, you typically have a sadhana. Like sometimes people think of yoga sadhanas. It's like a sadhana is like as a set of disciplines or practices that are all kind of a cohesive practice that you follow, like a meditation practice. So in Tibetan Buddhism, typically you've got visualization and you've got a mantra, right? And so you would have a practice where you would do the refuge at the beginning in the Buddha Dharma Sangha, and then raising compassion and bodhicitta, the thought of enlightenment or compassion for all beings. And then you would get into the practice, and it would be like a description of what the medicine Buddha in this case looks like, all the symbolism of the figure and that kind of thing. And then you would visualize and do a mantra, and then depending on the level of practice it is, you then might change the visualization to being yourself as that figure, right? And then you might dissolve it into emptiness and not be doing anything after that point. But so a lot of people, the way they practice, it can be practiced in many different ways, right? These kind of practices, you can practice it like people do with Om Mani Padme Hum, they, with prayer wheels and all that kind of stuff, right? You could just be throughout your day repeating a mantra. You could be doing it during formal practice periods. But with the medicine Buddha, it's like people use it for physical ailments and things, but it's really, the idea is, like you were saying earlier, that everything at its root is going to have like a spiritual cause or something like that, right? So if you can change your mind and even your body energetically or what have you, then that's going to ripple out and kind of take care of these grosser levels of reality. So that might be a good way to look at it.
Yeah, the Buddhism thing just still fascinates me. I mean, the concept that we're talking about right now, the medicine Buddha, seems to have spread at least as far as Afghanistan. there's a little known aspect of ancient Greek culture called the Greco-Buddhist Empire.
Oh yeah.
Do you know anything about that? It's not something I've been able to learn a whole lot about.
Well, I mean, a little bit in the sense of, right, you had Alexander the Greek, or Alexander the Great, not the Greek. That's Jimmy the Greek, I think I'm thinking of. Alexander the Great, made it into that region, right, into Afghanistan, and what we might have, at that time was kind of all India, like greater Indian culture in the subcontinent, Pakistan, Afghanistan, that area. And so I think they called them the Bactrians to that area. So it was like, because Greek became the language of trade and everything in those areas, even after the Greeks left, I think a lot of that culture stayed. And there was this commingling of Greco-Roman culture and stuff with Indian culture. I think I remember hearing that Alexander actually brought what were basically sadhus back with him, to on his way back towards Greece. Of course, I guess he never made it, right? But I guess the armies did. And so, yeah, there's even some schools of Greek philosophy that have a definite Buddhist or Hindu or kind of like pre-Buddhist, pre-Hindu kind of influence in there. But and then some of that stuff gets really hard to follow sometimes, because unless you can see directly where somebody translated specific terms or ideas, then it's hard to say, oh, this seems like it's comes straight from here. But if there's kind of like a missing link, right? Sometimes you can't. It seems like a common sense to look at them and say, oh, I really feel like I see this influence in there. And sometimes you can see those traces and sometimes you can't. But it's really interesting. I think there was a lot more cross-fertilization of ideas like that in the ancient world than we generally give them credit for these days.
And you focus mostly on the Taoist history or Taoist spiritual texts, right?
Yeah.
And that's kind of, I don't want to say a theological, but it's more about practices and mindfulness and being in the moment than about the worship of specific deities. Is that right?
Yes and no. I would say it's very similar. I think because people know Buddhism in the West much more than they know Taoism. I think thinking of it in terms similar to Tibetan Buddhism is helpful in that, if you don't know anything about Tibetan Buddhism, you look at it from the outside and you could be like, oh, look, it's like this big pantheon of gods and all these, different deities and stuff. And it's kind of like on one level that's true, and on another level, there are no deities in Buddhism. If you're looking at it from a absolute perspective, and Taoism is kind of similar. It's also kind of similar to Hindu ideas of like that there's an unmanifest ultimate reality that you may name or not name, and then everything else emanates from that. So in Taoism, it would be like everything emanates from the Tao, and whether you think of the gods as having some sort of absolute being or not would be up to your kind of personal interpretation. Although I will say that, there's the Buddhist school of philosophy, the Madhyamaka, that's like the middle way philosophy, right? Where you have like the ultimate and relative truths or ultimate and relative reality. And so those ideas pretty much permeated with Taoism. So philosophically, Taoism is very similar to that. So it's kind of like on an ultimate level, there's only the Tao, there's only the universe, right? But on a relative level, we have our own experiences. We may experience other beings, whether it's other people, animals, gods, ghosts, spirits of different kinds, whatever. And so we might say that they have a relative being or a relative reality to them, but maybe not an ultimate reality to them.
The doctrine of emanations, that's one of those keys that seems to permeate through lots and lots of esoteric systems, East and West, whether it's Kabbalah or Taoism or Hinduism. There's this unnameable, ineffable absolute, and then the different layers of mind that comprise the various levels of complexity of reality emanate from that sort of stillness where the nothing and something paradoxically collapse into a type of pleromic void. It's like flowery language, I know, but it's the best way to describe it. So I'm wondering, is there any other name that the ancients might have called Taoism before it started being called Taoism, or is there a more correct pronunciation to the Chinese people?
Well, in current Mandarin, it's definitely Dao, but it's interesting to look at the early roots. You have some scholars who are like, until you had organized Taoism that we know of, with the celestial masters in like 132 AD or whatever year it was, that's when Taoism starts. Even though they take the Tao Te Ching and Lao Tzu and everything, it's their founder, much earlier, right? But then you have scholars who can look at these old texts and say, well, no, you have all these stories of masters and disciples and lineages and stuff before that. And, they may not have called themselves Taoists before, 200 BC or something like that, but you can obviously see that it's the early roots of the people and the groups and the teachings of people who then later called themselves Taoists. So, they used to say things like, well, sometimes they combine terms, right, and say like Tian Dao, the Dao of heaven, or something like that, right, and not just Dao by itself. And then even if you read Confucian texts or there's the time period they call like the 100 schools or something like that, where you had legalists and naturalists and all these different people, and they were all talking about their various Daos, their various ways. And then I think you had the people who took that to a deeper level of like, this is the end all that we don't really have a name for, but we're going to throw that name on it because it makes the most sense, or it's a good placeholder. And, that's our orientation. And so we're going to call ourselves Taoists because we're trying to be in accord with, not just a way that we've come up with or his way, your way, but the way, like the way of the universe. So, yeah, I guess I'd leave it there.
The further back we go, the more murky it gets. But I'm wondering, let's talk a little bit about, you brought up Tian, which is the heavenly father, essentially, right? That's the whole heavens, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
Like the whole sky.
Yeah. In modern usage, it's like, yeah, the sky or the heavens, in the same way that, we might say heaven and mean it in a particular way, like in a Christian way or a Muslim way or something like that. Or we can talk about the heavens, when we're talking about the night sky, right? So there's those connections between, what we actually see and experience in the natural world, and then our ideas of what an afterlife or a pre-life might be or might have been. But yeah, in modern usage, it has to do with just the sky or like the weather, things like that. But yeah, I think at a certain point it was a little bit more anthropomorphized, and then it became more of a non-anthropomorphic kind of idea of the heavens. And I think one of the dynasties, one of the early dynasties had that more personified idea of it, like a heavenly father, or like Tian Di is often like the term they would have used back then.
Yeah, that's another big connection between East and West, actually, that they're calling the Heavenly Father Tian Di, because D means God in like the more Latinized and even Greek side of things. Interestinger still to me is how the precursors to the Romans, the ancient Etruscans who populated Italy, have a lot of connection to Phoenicians and seafarers who had trade routes that possibly, who knows, maybe even made it all the way over to China. Their top god, sort of the equivalent of the Roman Jupiter or the Greek Zeus, was called Tinia or Teen, which is like phonetically the same as the Chinese Sky Father.
Yeah, really similar. It's you wonder about all these things like the Silk Road and all those kinds of things. It's like, we only know them as far back as we can trace, with texts and archaeological evidence and all these sorts of things. And that at a certain point, there's no record just because everything was wood or everything has, rotted away, is no longer there. So occasionally, we find these perfectly preserved things in bogs and stuff like that. And we go, oh, wow, look, this is so much older than we thought it was. And it feels like we're constantly kind of pushing those boundaries backwards, right? And the more we do,
I think underestimating our ancestors has been a constant thing about historians and all that.
Yeah, like, oh, we're modern and different. And it's like, well, actually, every day it looks more and more like people 2,000 years ago were pretty much like us.
Yeah, maybe cleverer in a lot of ways, because working with less conveniences, which in a lot of ways have made us kind of weaker. Yeah. I wanted to, can we talk a little bit about the role of the stars, the three luminaries in Taoism?
Yeah, sure. So usually the three luminaries refers to like the sun, moon, and then the stars, just sort of generally. And it also can be symbolic of like the two eyes. The sun and moon can correspond to the two eyes. And one of the things I've always liked a lot about Taoism is the whole microcosm, macrocosm kind of idea. And it, I don't always like to draw too many inferences and things, but with, it seems like more and more with, fractal kind of ideas and modern physics and all these sorts of things that we see more and more patterns, that repeat themselves at different levels and stuff. And so Taoism is kind of just full of that, right? So that's something that's always kind of made me feel at home with it. So
that's how my experience of reality has been. I just like to say everything is everything.
Yeah.
That pretty much sums it up. But another connection too is you mentioned the sun and moon relating to the left and right eye. Maybe I've got it back to front, which is which, but that is also a concept in Egyptian mythology as well.
Yeah, and I'm sure in yogic and Buddhist traditions it's very similar too. Yeah, and so there was a lot of cross fertilization with Buddhism in Taoism too, much earlier on than a lot of people think, and so sometimes it was just in formats. Things like having three treasures, right? And in Buddhism, they usually talk about the three jewels, right, of Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. And so on a superficial level, Taoism was kind of like, hey, we're kind of in competition with this new thing that's come along here. What's this? And so they sort of followed some of the outer forms, and coming up with a similar idea of like taking refuge in three treasures. And of course, in the case of Taoism, it would be the Tao, and the Jing or the scriptures, and then the teachers. And so you have a similar outer form, but then they kind of kept all the metaphysics and all the language and all the roots that were already there. And so sometimes, scholars, of course, will argue about, what influence came from where and who influenced who, but there was a lot of back and forth in medieval China with all of that stuff. So for the better, I'd say probably for both sides. So
I'm particularly curious about the mention you make in the book of the stars of Ursa Major, the Big Dipper, being envisioned as star lords, each of the stars being a star lord. And I find that fascinating. To me, one of the most interesting elements of our world is the way that the heavens revolve, but there's that one point that seems to stay still, that it all moves around, the north, and inferring what the ancients might have been alluding to, when the ancients might have been alluding to that is always fascinating to me, because it seems like if you were going to represent the Tao as anything, it would probably be that pole star, because it's the one thing that doesn't move and everything seems to emanate and revolve around it.
Yeah, for sure. And there's even there's an allusion to that in from Confucius even as well. I don't know if I can look it up quickly, but basically it's like the ideal, of course, Confucians, and in that time period, they were all trying to advise rulers, right? And so that was the model they were always looking at. And so the idea was that if the ruler is virtuous and still and is kind of like embodying that principle, that the entire world is revolving around them, right? And similar to the sky revolving around the North Star. Yeah. So it's like that. If you wanted to have a correspondence between inner and outer, it would be like, if you're finding that still point within yourself would be like akin to that North Star. Yeah.
And what about the Ursa Major stars as star lords? What exactly do you make of that?
Well, they use that. That's used in ritual and things, but it's
isn't there also like a dance of moving around the positions of each of the 7 stars of Ursa Major or something along those lines?
Yeah, there definitely is. There's a lot of different versions of those sorts of things, and Taoist ritual is really complicated and is not really well sort of disseminated, let's say, or translated or what have you in the West. It's like there are definitely some people who know something about Taoist ritual, but I think very few people so far have been really immersed in it in a deep way. For example, one of my teachers is actually in China right now going through in Quanzhen Taoism, which is usually considered more of a monastic tradition, certainly in its modern version. They do different levels of precepts, right? And a big formal ceremony where a large group of people are doing the precepts together. But they spend like a month doing it, right? So they do all these rituals, all these teachings, all these practices, on and on and on and on. And so one of my teachers who's doing that now is like, I think one of the first Westerners to ever do that. And so a lot of the esoteric side of Taoism or the ritual aspects are just really kind of still unknown in the West. I mean, a lot of people piece things together from books and things, or they've learned one part of something and kind of extrapolate it into other areas. And it's like a little bit different than being fully immersed in it and having it taught to you step by step by step. And so, I mean, what I know about Taoist ritual is like a drop in the bucket compared to my teachers. But there's different practices where you would move amongst the stars of the Dipper, but then there are all kinds of other ones too where you do all kinds of different patterns. And the Dipper stars are also related to astrology in China, and so the idea of the Star Lords is that the sign you were born under, like year of the rat, in my case, something like that, correspond to the different stars of the Dipper. So the idea is that one of those stars has a greater influence on your life or the circumstances and placement and things of your birth. And so there are, scriptures like the Beidou Jing, the Northern Dipper scripture, that focus on the stars of the Dipper and the Star Lords, and doing practices related to that. Yeah, so
I'm a snake up in here. Probably why I wound up as like a spiritual seeker podcast researcher. Kind of fits.
Yeah, there you go.
Another, man, there's a lot of cool stuff in what we just opened up, like Chinese astrology and the huge mystery that's still remaining about Taoist ritual. But back to the 7 stars of the Dipper, there was something you mentioned about connecting with the Dipper stars on your birthday. Can you talk about that, at least maybe conceptually or as a practice that somebody can do, why it was recommended or prescribed?
Yeah, I would say both. I mean, it's certainly, in a monastery or in a temple, usually they would do a Beidou Jing on certain days of the month, but also you could certainly do it on your birthday. And I think the idea I was getting at there was just that, like, on your birthday is when the conditions are similar to when you were born, and so you maybe have a little closer connection to your star on that day, and that you might give a little extra emphasis towards that. But in practice, when you do Dipper practices, your orientation is towards all of the stars, of course. But the one in particular that oversaw your birth might have a little closer relationship there.
So we're talking about the 7 stars of the Dipper, but there was another thing, a snippet that I caught out of the book referring to 5 notes and 5 colors. And I thought that was interesting as opposed to a more Western perception of there being 7. I know there's like 5 elements in Chinese medicine, so they're probably referring to that, but can you talk a little bit about the system of 5, maybe in comparison to 7, or what's special about 5, or why that was a revered number of the wholeness or the completeness?
Yeah, so it does go along with the 5 element or 5 phases theory in Chinese medicine. It's something that's kind of, pan Chinese culture, even beyond Taoism or predating Taoism as it's sort of formally structured, but it permeates everything. So it's in medicine, it's in astrology, it's in the 5 flavors, the directions. You have 4 directions in the center. All that stuff relates, and on one level, it's like in like any other system where you have sort of sacred numbers. Sometimes it might feel like things are just put in those groupings because they've decided we like these numbers, and so we're going to count things according to them, right? So like the Bagua, you have 8, right? So sometimes you'll see things and it's like, oh, these correspond to the Bagua because there's 8 of them. And it's like, well, there may or may not be much of a connection there, especially if it's something modern, like in martial arts or something like that, right? Sometimes it's that they were wanting to draw a connection between the two, so they just would call something 8 or Bagua or something like that because there was 8 aspects to it. But in terms of 5, it's definitely relates to that whole system of correspondences.
Although they're probably aware that maybe there's more than 5 colors.
Yeah.
Who knows though? There allegedly, or I say allegedly, but there's some schools that thought that if we don't have a concept of something, we don't really see it.
Yeah.
In particular, when you look at, say, the works of Homer, like the Iliad, the sea is referred to as wine dark. And in fact, there's like a very interestingly conspicuous absence of descriptions that refer to things in what we would consider blue, as if that was like not understood. and things like the sea and the sky were talked more about like violet or green rather than blue. So who knows? They even say that about the ancient Native Americans not being able to perceive the ships of Europeans on the horizon because they didn't have a concept of that. It's one of those things we can't know.
Yeah. It's like, it is interesting that it's like, with colors, it's like, okay, if you only have 5 crayons and you just grew up with 5 crayons or something, would all those variations and shades in between really make any sense to you, or what if you just saw them and they didn't have names, you'd be like, what is this? Like, or would you just lump them into those 5 categories and call it a day and just say, oh, this is a little bit lighter red, this is a little bit darker red, this is light green. And
one of my most memorable Tao type experiences before I even had that type of language, like young in life, I had a momentary epiphany and it was like one of the first times I felt connected to nature. I was looking out at the world and realized all this time I've been just thinking, yeah, all that grass, all those trees, it's just green. But in that moment, I had like a heightened consciousness and I could see the variations of all the different shades of green and the minutia of that. And I realized, oh, this is a huge palette of spectrum and difference. It's not all one thing. So that attention that we can pay to the intricacy and the nuance in our world, that's part of what brings us into what you would consider the moment or the Tao for those type of transcendental mystical things.
Yeah, definitely. There's I'm trying to think, I think they call it plant blindness. When people, have grown up in modern society and they're so disconnected from nature that they can't make those distinctions, right? They look out and they just see green and they just see trees and they're like, in their head, it's all the same. And then when you take people out in like forest therapy or something like that and get them to really slow down and focus and start to notice those differences, then they're like kind of blown away. Like, oh my God, I had no idea that tree looks nothing like that tree. And I used to think it was just all trees, right? And then you can almost have the opposite where sometimes people get so hung up on classifications and things that then they don't experience the actual thing in front of them, right? They've got all these names and facts and figures and ideas about a thing in their head, and maybe they've never actually touched or interacted with the real thing in the real world,
That's like the Baudrillard notion of hyperreality, where our labels of things and our language filter becomes what we see and experience rather than the thing itself. And in many ways, it's removing those layers of assumption that is necessary for us to fully immerse and experience the thing itself in all aspects of life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, having that kind of beginner's mind thing where you can have a direct experience and a direct perception of something without all that intermediation. Yeah, for sure.
And we left this out of the introduction. I forgot to mention that you also take people into forest bathing type therapy, right? Can we speak on that?
Yeah, sure. I, was interested in nature connection stuff for a long time. Partly just for a love of being out there myself. But then when I had an acupuncture practice, it kind of hit me more and more that, a lot of people's problems were just living kind of unnatural lifestyles and doing things that, we might say didn't accord with the Tao and didn't flow with life and that sort of thing. And so just getting back into more natural patterns of, sleeping and waking and eating and, not staying up all night with the lights on when, the sun's been down for hours and hours and on all these kind of natural rhythms, that our bodies evolved to follow. So, that kind of was leading me into that direction. And I think probably about not sure the time period here. In that time period around 2010 or so, I got involved with some different modalities like MoveNat. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but natural movement is kind of the umbrella of some of these kind of back to nature-y exercise modalities and stuff like that, right? So I was kind of getting interested in all these sorts of things. And then forest therapy really was kind of starting to bubble up in the Western consciousness a little bit. The modern version of it is out of Japan as Shinrin-yoku, or forest bathing. And that was just coined in the early 80s by the head of the forestry department over there. So it's kind of a modern idea, but of course it's kind of a universal idea, right? Of all indigenous cultures around the world. Thinking that, if we're out of balance or something's not right, that we need to get back in nature's embrace, kind of thing. And so forest therapy really grew out of that as a way of guiding people into having a deeper experience with nature. And the idea is there's some similar things like ecotherapy, or things where it's like a therapist or a psychologist using natural principles to help people. This is more as a guide. You're sort of setting up the conditions, or you're sort of guiding people into the forest. But the saying is that the guide opens the doors, but the forest is the therapist. So you're really trying to lead people into an unmediated experience with nature, and that they'll find what they need in that interaction with nature itself. So,
Can you talk about any maybe like cases of people that have benefited from that you've guided through the process?
Well, I mean, it can be, it can be as simple as, someone feels really stressed and just like they can't relax, they can't settle down, everything seems like it's going crazy in their life or whatever. And then, you first get into the forest, your head's still spinning, thoughts are still going, you're thinking about everything but where you are, and after an hour or two, sometimes people don't even notice along the way, but by the end of the walk, they're like, oh, wait, like I'm here. I am present. I am here with these, beings and the trees and the forest, or the other participants in the walk and what have you. And a lot of times people will have, things in the forest, something in the interaction between their mind, their emotions, what's going on internally with them, and what they're seeing externally. The forest will kind of mirror what's going on, and sometimes people aren't even aware of what it is. And like you were saying earlier about releasing things from the past and things like that, people will see a tree that's injured or something, and it reminds them of their grandparent that died, and like some unresolved issue, or some they didn't get to say goodbye, or like it could be any number of things like that, and they'll have this sort of release and this experience of like, oh, it's okay, they know, they knew I loved them, just like this tree is here, and I feel a sense of connection with it. And often it's that kind of unity experience too, where people just feel a sense of belonging and connection, and can just relax into it.
Yeah, there's so many things we could say about the who would have thunk it, being in nature without human artificial stuff causes health promoting effects, in particular the electricity side of it, just being more grounded, allowing the negative charge to flow out of your body and into the earth as it's meant to,
Mhm.
we're so disconnected often with the rubber soled shoes. And
Yep.
hey, if you hugged a tree recently,
That's
it's
right.
not,
You've got,
it's actually really good for you.
yeah, totally. And you've got, negative ions coming from waterfalls and cascades and things like that. And you've got, um, you know, different essential oils and chemicals coming from the trees and the plants themselves, that are beneficial for your immune system. And it's like on so many different levels. And it's like, it should be common sense. It makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. Like, this is where we evolved in relationship with all these other things. We didn't evolve in a vacuum. We didn't evolve within four walls in hermetically sealed buildings and stuff. So it makes sense that if we put ourselves back into those conditions that we're attuned to, that it's going to be good for us. Yeah. But every day they come up with some new nuance of like, oh, it's also good for this because of this relationship and that, and on and on.
So we're going to make take our break now and go between the first part and the second part. But Gregory, we let people know how they can get your book, where they might be able to connect with you if you're open to that, and
Sure.
anything else you want to promote or let them know about as we're finishing out part one.
Yeah, for sure. So the book, I'll happen to have one here, so I'll hold it up. Oh, there it is. My author copies just came about a week ago, so that was kind of exciting. So it's put out by Inner Traditions, and I'm sure it'll be available everywhere. Certainly, you can order it anywhere. It's pre-order right now. It'll be out December 5th. There's also going to be a audiobook on the way at some point. We've already recorded it, but I have no idea when they are planning to put it out. So it could be soon, could be in a few months. I don't know, but that'll be fun too. You can order it. Any bookstore can order it. You can find it on all the usual channels online. So
Very cool. Any socials you want them to maybe follow?
sure.
I saw you have an Instagram.
Yeah, at Gregory Ripley on Instagram. I think the same on Twitter or whatever it is, X these days. Threads,
confusing.
I'm probably over there too. And you can find me on Facebook. You can find me all those places. And my website's the same, gregoryripley.com. So I've tried to keep things pretty straightforward for people. So.
Awesome. Well, thanks for being here, man. And I'm looking forward to part two. Got lots more on my mind.
Sure. Sounds good. Thanks.
All right. Feels good to be back in the saddle for an InnerVerse episode. And I hope you guys enjoyed this one. It's one of the perks of being a podcaster is that publishers will sometimes send you catalogs of what they got coming out. And I saw the title of this book, 100 Remedies of the Tao, and I knew I wanted to give it a shot. Check it out. Really do enjoy Taoist philosophy in a lot of ways. I wouldn't say I'm a 100% true believer. I think we got to take what works and leave the rest with everything. But in this conversation, we covered a lot of ground, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. I think Greg seems like a real swell fella, and there's probably more gravy in there that we could mine out in terms of the Taoist esoteric side of things, alchemy, and particularly, if there's anybody out there that knows of somebody that has a grasp on the star myths of ancient China, whether Taoist or Confucianism or anything of the sort, even Buddhism, I'd love to explore more of the astrotheology of that part of the world, because I'm finding little connections here and there between East and West with what little I know of Chinese mythology. And I think there's a lot more to be found. In particular, pretty interested in something that came up in hour 2 with Pangu. And I'm going to do some more research into that particular, what would you call it? The primordial being, Pangu, and see how I can connect that into the weaves with our Loki series that we got going, which I'll say more about later. But if you guys have not been accessing hour 2 of the InnerVerse episodes, got to let you know they're very much where it's at. It's the best way to support this podcast, which is me personally, me and my wife. I would love to have your ears on the second hour of all these episodes. There's a huge archive of them. So you can get that on Rockfin, ROKFIN.com/InnerVerse or Patreon.com/InnerVerse. Either of those options will get you access to this particular Plus extension and a big archive of all the other ones. And in this second hour, we started out getting into the ancestors, the relationship of the living to their ancestors in Taoism. I think there's a lot more meat on those bones that we could probably pull out, but it's fascinating nonetheless. And the previously mentioned Pangu, the primordial being, and other types of mythological syncretism between Taoism and other parts of the world. We also talked about the dynastic cycles as a representative of world ages and the emperor as a sacred center, like a pole star. Got into Dantian, the furnace of the body, the lower energy center, its relation to Mercury, cinnabar fields, internal alchemy. We also discussed more of the Wu Wei versus a more contrived type of action called Wu Wei, good and the bad in each of those possibilities. Talked about the messiah versus a healthy ego and enlightened selfhood. Particular interesting little thread came up about the eclipses, how eclipses in the ancient Chinese mythology represented a potential threatening of the mandate of heaven for the current ruler or dynasty, and how there was a saving of the sun ritual that corresponded with when people saw that sun get dark when it shouldn't with an eclipse. And we also talked about some really good advice regarding keeping hold of our unique spiritual epiphanies even in difficult times, even when the sine wave of life dips into a trough rather than being up on a peak. So all that and more in the second hour. Hope you guys check it out. Really appreciate you being here either way. And I thought I'd leave us in this outro thinking about some linguistic potential syncretism regarding this phonetic of Shen. So Shen in Chinese, it's usually a suffix attached to like a deity's name, but it represents as a phonetic the energy of our mental, creative, and spiritual existence. Shen is responsible for all mental activities, thinking, cognition, thought processes, everything that has to do with logic and intelligence and memory and ingenuity. And in Japanese, Shen is true or heart. It also can mean new. In the Hebrew, Shen is the letter of fire and transformation, and the 3 teeth in this shape of this letter represent the 3 pillars of the tree of life. And then I thought, what's very similar to this idea of Shen is san in Latin, which is the root of words like sanct, as in like sanctity, if you will, or sanctuary. San in Latin, S-A-N, has the meaning of health. And if you've been following along with our philological exposés that we do here, you know that the S sound sh is also S sound is also the SH sound of sh. And there's for sure some crossover between the SH sound and the T and the TH sound too. So we talked about tien or tian and tenia and ten. And there's a definite connection there with san and shen, linguistically speaking. So thought I'd leave that on the table. And another thing that didn't come up in this conversation that I found interesting in the book had to do with like the conceptualization in Taoism of 10 different layers of our being. I think that there's for sure a weave there that might connect the Taoism system to the ancient Egypt system regarding our different layers of our being and our different bodies. So definitely a lot more to potentially dig into with Taoism. And I hope to sooner than later. I'll be doing this a long time though, so we'll get there eventually. Hope you guys enjoyed the episode. Really appreciate you being here. Lots of ways to support the show besides just getting the Plus extension. I'd love it if you did some or all of it. Tippecanoe Herbs is linked in the show notes. You can get a 10% discount on some really good medicine and use the InnerVerse coupon code to do that. You can also get great supplements from Clive to Carl with my affiliate link. You can pick up the Spirit World audiobooks I've produced, and you'll be supporting both me and my buddy Dylan Sakosio. Great resource of knowledge for comprehending the syncretism that I'm always trying to point to in these conversations. And also, it's possible to get yourself a tuning, or, I don't advertise it as much. I also do divination sessions where we'll utilize the tarot and the I Ching and bring the East to meet the West and have a really powerful transmission of hopefully a lot of wisdom for where you're at in your life currently. I really enjoy those divination sessions, but I haven't done a lot of them lately because I never remind people that they're a possibility. So whether tuning or divination, I'm here to take you as a client, and we get to hang out and have a mystical experience together. It's a lot of fun and very potent. So with that, I'll leave you guys, and I'll see you on the next one. Oh, wanted to also remind you, get into our Loki series. I'm loath to tell you to sign up to Disney Plus, but the Loki TV show, even if you don't really know much about Marvel Comics, it's not necessary. It stands alone, and it's such a great launching point for us to talk about tons of the esoteric mystery school system and the keys to the symbolism of that universal system. The last episode of Loki recently came out, and I feel like it basically justified everything I've been saying about the character and about the symbolism in the show up to this point. So I'm definitely feeling like a lot of excitement to continue that series, even through 12 whole parts, to talk about every episode. And I'd love to have you along for the ride. It's one of the most exciting things right now to me. I am a huge comic book nerd, so I can't help it, but it's fun. It's fun using allegory and stories as a vehicle for teaching and comprehending. So we're going to keep doing that. And I hope you join us. Me and Gabe have been crushing it. We're only 3 episodes deep, so definitely not too much to catch up on. And, those streams are only about 4 hours each. I think they'll be more concise as we go, but we'll see. Once I get into analyzing individual episodes, it just starts to spiral out of control because there's so much in there, but that's what makes it fun. And all right, I'll catch you guys on the next episode. Thanks for being here. Love ya, and be good. Bye-bye.